The Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute is driving bold policy solutions for a resilient Canadian agri-food system and building a stronger future for Canadian agriculture. Visit capi-icpa.com to discover how.
Shaun Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and RealAg Radio, and we're in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we're at the BASF headquarters, and we're joined right now by Kim Tutor, who is the Technical Marketing Manager for Fungicides with BASF. How are we doing today, Kim?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So there's no secret. There are a lot of profitability challenges for farmers as we close out 25 and we think about 2026. Where does, in this kind of a market, where does fungicides fit into the crop management plan?
Well, fungicides, are really an integral part of any type of agronomic plan, regardless of the crop that you're growing or the region that you're in. And BASF's performance-driven fungicides, the reason it's such an integral part of that plan is because they continue to deliver value year in and year out, regardless of the geography, regardless of the environmental conditions. They deliver that consistent performance in terms of yield and ROI. I like to think of an analogy like running a marathon. You don't sign up to run a marathon and get 90% of the way through and then give up. And so I know oftentimes fungicides, typically being one of the last passes across that acre, can be brought into question. Maybe I want to save a few dollars here or there. And I would just challenge that and encourage your growers and listeners to think about that. What kind of yield are you leaving on the table, right? Especially in these lower commodity market conditions when prices are low, every bushel, every pound, every unit you can get counts. And so BASF performance-driven fungicides like Veltima on corn, Revitec on soybeans, and our newly launching Zarina fungicide that's coming in 2026, all of those are integral parts of an agronomic plan. They're going to help protect your investment in that crop.
And initially, when growing up on the farm, I always thought of fungicides as like reactive. And I think at the time maybe we thought of them as kind of a reactive solution. I see disease, spray. Well, we're kind of moved to where we see value in more of the proactive, which I think is kind of what you're talking about.
Oh, for sure. It definitely pays to be proactive instead of reactive. And a lot of that really comes down to the concept of latent period of fungal diseases. And so every fungal disease in corn and soy, they all have a latent period, and that's that time between initial infection and reproduction. So that disease is inside the plant. It's robbing that plant of its yield potential. It's reducing photosynthesis before you can ever detect a lesion with the naked eye. And they vary in terms of length. So take, for example, southern rust that was really problematic across the Midwest and even up into the northern plains, up into Minnesota in 2025. Southern rust has a latent period of 7 to 10 days. So it's going to go through a reproductive cycle pretty quickly and you'll start to detect those lesions. Now, tar spot, which has also been the disease that's been top of mind for a lot of corn growers over the last couple years, it has a really long latent period, upwards of 2 to 3 weeks. So that's really, when you're thinking about the disease spectrum and all the potential diseases that can attack your crop, depending on whichever one it is that comes in, that's why it pays to be proactive instead of reactive, because that disease, oftentimes if you wait until some of those lesions are starting to become visibly evident, you're kind of behind the 8 ball, right? Because it's wreaking havoc inside that plant before you ever know it's there.
Yeah.
So hence why it pays to be proactive.
Are there situations where it doesn't fit to use the fungicide then? Like where, it's like, you know what? Doesn't make sense this year.
The old adage, the only 2 things in life that are certain, death and taxes, right?
Yeah.
And I'd like to challenge that. I think there's a third one that you can add to that list, and that's stress. So every year, our crops experience some kind of stress, and I think historically, fungicides used to be thought of as, I only spray if I have disease. But with BASF's fungicide portfolio, there are benefits outside of that disease control. So helping those crops improve their growth efficiency, increase their nitrogen utilization and net photosynthesis. We also often forget about what's happening below ground, right? We're so used to focusing on what's happening above the ground, but our products have been proven to support both that shoot growth as well as that basal growth. right? So we know that having larger root systems helps those plants, especially if they start to encounter stress in terms of reaching water and nutrients. But there's also an environmental stress mitigation piece to our fungicides as well. So again, back to that idea of you never know what stress is going to be. It could be hot, it could be dry, and no one fungicide is ever going to replace a rain event. However, BASF's performance-driven fungicides help that crop get from one rain event to the next. So we know that we help keep the stomates, kind of like the pores or the vents, if you will, on those leaf surfaces open. And that's important because it allows that plant to continue that gas exchange process and to continue driving photosynthesis, which is ultimately what impacts yield. So it's not just disease control. And that's often what some people think about, right? There are other benefits outside of that. And that's why year in and year out, if you take more of a long-term perspective and look at the benefits that fungicides bring over time, it's going to help mitigate that stress.
So how do I judge success? Is it ultimately yield? You mentioned ROI earlier, and when we look at farmers' adoption of technology, one of those barriers is, well, I got to get a return, but the ROI, what that return they're seeking, is not necessarily always very clear. So what is the ROI of fungicides?
Well, I think it's going to vary, right? It's going to vary field to field, and it's going to vary year to year. And that's not to say that, in years where you have, let's say, less stress or less disease pressures, you may not see as high of a yield bump. But then you do have those years where that stress level is much greater. You are more likely to see a larger return. And so generally speaking, when we think about our performance-driven brands like Veltima and Revitech and RealAg fungicides, two rules of thumb. 8 times out of 10, these brands are going to out-yield other fungicide brands that are available on the market today. 9 times out of 10, it's going to outperform and out-yield that untreated acre. And so I'm not really a betting person, but if I was, those are pretty good odds, right? 8 out of 10 and 9 times out of 10. And so again, it just kind of speaks to that consistent performance. We know we have variability in weather patterns. We have variability in terms of disease and stress. And so for me, success with a fungicide is just seeing that consistent performance and knowing that I've invested in a product that's going to help protect my bottom line year after year.
Because we're starting to use fungicides more routinely, it's a part of that plan, as you've been talking about, in that good, solid gamble, but less of a gamble. It probably shouldn't use the word gamble, or it's a safe bet. Do we need to be worried about fungicide resistance at all, or what's the latest research in that area?
So we do have some species that are resistant, in particular in soybeans, but we haven't seen that type of resistant to date in corn. However, what's so unique about our performance fungicide brands is the power of our active ingredient, Revysol. So Revysol, which is a common active ingredient across Revitech, RealAg, and Veltima, it's the newest DMI that's on the market today. And what's so special about Revysol really comes down to its chemical structure. It has what they call an isopropanol link. And all that means is that its chemical structure has the ability with that link to flex and to move. And that's important because what it does is it allows that molecule to get inside those binding sites of those fungal pathogens that may be a little bit difficult for some other AIs to get into. And that's particularly true for those resistant species. So it can bind more effectively and more strongly to combat some of those resistant strains that we have seen to date.
Where does the future of fungicides go? Obviously, BASF's a company putting millions of dollars a year into research. Where do we see the future fungicides landing?
Well, BASF is committed to helping the farmer improve and stay consistent with their performance on every acre. We're excited that we have our Zarina fungicide coming to launch in 2026. Zarina is labeled for soybeans, dry beans, and canola, and it's really showcasing its performance in terms of white mold, which we know is a problematic soybean disease in that kind of northern plains geography, but also Cercospora species as well, which are also problematic. And we do have other fungicides in the pipeline. Again, to your point, we're investing every single day and remain committed to bringing the newest and the best innovation to help farmers be successful.
So just curious about the future in application. So we talked about fungicides as a real preventative tool, and the diseases or the stress can be happening even when the visual isn't actually there. Is there a future for like spot spraying of fungicides or targeted drone spraying of fungicides, or will it stay more of a full broad acre application because of that?
Well, I think, again, it's going to depend on the operation and it's going to depend on the year. I mean, for example, we know that there are a lot of fungicide applications being made via drones today, right? Particularly in those areas, for example, underneath power lines or kind of some weird field corners where it's not as easy for a ground rig or for an airplane to get to. And so I think it's really going to become an integrated approach from that perspective, meaning that, you do have the potential to use different tools in the tool belt. However, if you think back to that consistent performance piece, if you're seeing a consistent improvement in terms of yield and overall crop health, why would you not treat all your acres?
Well, it's different than weeds, right? Where see weed, kill weed.
Exactly.
If some of the stresses are there and they're not visual, then that's a different scenario for sure. Kim, thanks so much for joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.